Nebuchadnezzar was born into a world already shaking beneath the weight of history. A world where empires collapsed not quietly, but violently, where cities burned, gods fell, and power was seized by those ruthless enough to claim it. His father, Nabopolassar, was not born a king. He was forged into one through rebellion, blood, and vision. The man who shattered Assyrian domination and raised Babylon from humiliation into supremacy. And from the moment Nebuchadnezzar opened his eyes, he was surrounded by the language of destiny. War councils instead of lullabies, victory chants instead of childhood games, priests speaking of omens, generals speaking of conquest, scribes recording history as if it already belonged to his family. He did not grow up learning right from wrong. He grew up learning strong from weak, ruler from ruled, conqueror from erased. Babylon itself was his classroom, a city roaring with ambition, temples rising toward the sky, ziggurats casting shadows like stairways to heaven, markets overflowing, with wealth pulled from fallen empires, every brick whispering that Babylon was chosen, and that its rulers were more than men. From an early age, Nebuchadnezzar was trained not just as a prince, but as a symbol, taught that kingship was sacred, that power flowed downward from the gods, and that obedience was proof of divine order. Priests reinforced this belief daily. Rituals declared the king as Marduk's chosen. Victories were celebrated as signs of divine favor, and failure was explained away as temporary imbalance. Never as fault, Nebuchadnezzar absorbed this worldview deeply, not questioning it, but embodying it. When he first accompanied his father on campaigns, he saw the fear in enemy eyes. The way entire cities surrendered at the sound of Babylonian drums. The way resistance ended in annihilation. And he learned the most dangerous lesson of all. That fear works. That terror creates order faster than mercy ever could. His first independent command came while still young, and it was here that his legend truly began, leading Babylonian forces with a precision beyond his years, crushing opposition with calculated brutality, not for cruelty's sake, but for efficiency. Each victory was deliberate, each defeat of an enemy designed to echo beyond the battlefield. His name spread across the Near East as a force that could not be reasoned with, only obeyed. And with every campaign, his confidence grew heavier. Not confidence in strategy alone, but confidence in self, a growing certainty that he was not merely favored by fate, but central to it. When Nabopolassar died and Nebuchadnezzar ascended the throne, the transition was seamless. There was no doubt, no challenge, no hesitation. Babylon accepted him as naturally as it accepted the rising sun. And Nebuchadnezzar accepted the crown not as a burden, but as confirmation. He ruled with relentless energy, expanding borders, crushing rebellions, reshaping the political map of the ancient world. Jerusalem fell, kingdoms vanished. Populations were uprooted and transplanted like pieces on a board, all under his command. Yet even as his empire expanded outward, his inner world was changing. Nebuchadnezzar began to see Babylon not as a city, but as an extension of himself. Its walls his bones, its gates his voice, its glory his reflection. He rebuilt Babylon obsessively, not merely restoring it, but elevating it into something mythic. Walls so thick chariots raced atop them, gates covered in blue glazed bricks, and golden symbols, temples that demanded awe, all bearing inscriptions proclaiming his greatness, not subtly, but boldly, proudly, repeatedly. He wanted the world to know that Babylon stood because he stood, that history existed because he ruled. Priests praised him, subjects bowed, monuments immortalized him, and slowly the idea formed in his mind that no human could achieve what he had achieved without being more than human. The gods had chosen him, yes, but perhaps he was something closer to them than to ordinary men. And this thought, once planted, began to grow quietly, invisibly, shaping his identity, shaping his decisions, shaping the way he spoke of himself. Babylon entered a golden age, but beneath the gold lay a dangerous foundation, because the king, who had mastered war, had begun to confuse success with divinity. And the man who ruled nations had started to believe that limits applied to others, not to him. Nebuchadnezzar's rise was not accidental. It was engineered through constant war. And war reshaped his mind long before it reshaped the world. As prince, and later as king, he learned that hesitation invited rebellion, that mercy encouraged resistance, and that decisive violence produced stability. He became a master of overwhelming force, striking quickly, destroying thoroughly, and leaving behind lessons written in ash and silence. Every campaign was designed not only to defeat enemies, but to erase the idea of defiance itself. Jerusalem was not conquered simply as a strategic move. It was broken as a warning. Its temple looted, its elites exiled, its identity fractured, and Nebuchadnezzar watched as his authority reshaped. Cultures beyond Babylon's walls, entire peoples, learned new languages, new customs, new gods under his command. And this reinforced his growing belief that he was not merely ruling land, but reshaping humanity. He surrounded himself with astrologers, diviners, and priests who interpreted dreams, and stars always in his favor. Every sign was explained as confirmation, never contradiction. When troubling visions appeared, they were not warnings, but puzzles to be solved, challenges to be conquered like armies on the field. Yet these dreams disturbed him deeply. Towering statues of gold and iron, collapsing kingdoms, voices speaking of limits and succession. And though he demanded interpretations, his fear betrayed him. Because deep inside, Nebuchadnezzar understood that if the gods spoke of endings, then even he might have one. And this thought terrified him more than any enemy. So he responded not with humility, but with escalation, more building, more conquest, more self-glorification. He erected statues of immense size, symbols of permanence, and demanded loyalty not only to Babylon, but to his image. Obedience became ritual, dissent became sacrilege, and slowly Nebuchadnezzar's rule shifted from kingship to cult. His power was no longer justified only through conquest, but through enforced reverence. Those who questioned his authority were not traitors, but blasphemers. And this marked a critical transformation. Because when a ruler demands worship, he no longer seeks loyalty. He seeks validation. Nebuchadnezzar's obsession with control extended inward. He became increasingly isolated, trusting fewer voices, listening only to those who affirmed his greatness, surrounding himself with symbols rather than people. His court glittered but grew hollow. Fear replaced counsel. Praise replaced truth. And the king who once relied on strategy now relied on belief. Belief in his own exceptionalism. Belief that the gods could not act against him because he was their instrument. Yet the more he declared his greatness, the more unstable his inner world became. Pride and insecurity began to intertwine, feeding each other. He boasted publicly while privately demanding reassurance from omens and dreams. The empire still thrived, but the man at its center was becoming fragmented, and history teaches that when a ruler's identity becomes larger than reality, collapse is inevitable. Nebuchadnezzar stood at the peak of power, yet unknowingly at the edge of his psychological descent. Because the belief that he was godlike was no longer symbolic. It was personal, internal, absolute, and once that line was crossed, the greatest king of Babylon would begin a journey not into further conquest, but into madness, humiliation, and the ultimate confrontation between human pride and human limits. As Nebuchadnezzar's empire stabilized through fear and obedience, his focus slowly shifted from the battlefield to the city itself, because conquest alone was not enough for a man who believed history revolved around him. Babylon had to become more than a capital. It had to become a statement, a physical declaration that his rule was eternal, unquestionable, and favored by forces beyond human reach. And so Nebuchadnezzar began the most ambitious construction program the ancient world had ever witnessed. Not driven by necessity, but by identity, he rebuilt Babylon as if rebuilding himself. Brick by brick, wall by wall, layer by layer, the city expanded outward and upward. Massive fortification walls rose so thick that chariots could ride side by side upon them. Gates became monumental, not just entrances, but messages. The Ishtar Gate exploded with color and symbolism. Deep blue glazed bricks, lions, dragons, and bulls marching in endless procession. Each animal chosen carefully to represent power, divine protection, and cosmic order. And every inscription reminded the viewer who was responsible. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, chosen of Marduk, restorer of the world. He inscribed his name obsessively, as if repetition itself could defeat time. Temples were restored and enlarged, especially the great temple of Marduk, whose elevation mirrored Nebuchadnezzar's own rising self-image. Priests praised him publicly. Rituals reinforced his divine favor. Festivals celebrated his achievements as blessings for all people, and Babylonian religion became increasingly intertwined with Nebuchadnezzar's authority. The king was no longer simply protected by the gods. He was presented as their agent, their instrument, the living proof of cosmic balance, and Nebuchadnezzar embraced this fully. He funded rituals, expanded priesthoods, and demanded precision in worship, not out of humility, but out of control. Because control over religion meant control over belief, and belief meant obedience without resistance. Babylon's streets filled with laborers, artisans, engineers, scribes, slaves, and exiles from conquered lands, all forced into the machinery of Nebuchadnezzar's vision. Canals were rebuilt to control water and agriculture, turning nature itself into a servant of the state. Warehouses overflowed with grain, gold, and tribute. Markets thrived under imperial protection, and Babylon became the richest city the world had ever seen. Travelers described it as impossible, overwhelming, divine, and Nebuchadnezzar absorbed these descriptions like fuel. The more the world admired Babylon, the more he believed Babylon existed because of him alone. Architecture became psychology in stone, each structure reinforcing his sense of permanence, each wall silencing the idea of collapse. And yet this obsession with building masked a growing fear, because the desire to make something eternal often comes from an inability to accept mortality. Nebuchadnezzar feared endings, feared decline, feared the idea that his empire could one day fall as Assyria had fallen before him. And so he built as if building could freeze time, as if brick and stone could resist fate. Myths grew around his projects, stories of impossible gardens rising. Above the city, lush terraces suspended in the air, watered by ingenious systems. Whether legend or reality, the hanging gardens became symbolic of Nebuchadnezzar's mindset, an attempt to recreate paradise itself within human reach. A declaration that Babylon was not merely blessed by heaven, but capable of imitating it. And at the center of it all stood the king, increasingly distant from ordinary human experience. Surrounded by luxury, yet isolated by power, his court became ceremonial, rigid, predictable. Praise flowed freely, but honesty disappeared. Fear replaced counsel, and silence replaced challenge. Nebuchadnezzar's authority was absolute but fragile, because absolute authority depends on constant reinforcement, and so rituals multiplied. Statues were erected, loyalty was demanded, publicly and punished privately. Dissent was no longer political disagreement, but spiritual rebellion. The king's image appeared everywhere, in reliefs, inscriptions, public spaces. His presence became unavoidable, and this saturation fed his growing god complex. Nebuchadnezzar no longer saw himself as ruling on behalf of the gods. He saw himself as proof that the gods had chosen him above all others. His speeches shifted subtly. Where once he thanked Marduk, he now praised Babylon and himself together, merging city and king into a single idea. When foreign envoys arrived, they were overwhelmed intentionally, marched through processional ways designed to humiliate and astonish, shown monuments that dwarfed human scale, reminded visually that resistance against Babylon was resistance against the order of the world. And Nebuchadnezzar watched their reactions closely, feeding on awe, measuring submission. Yet beneath the surface, the king's mind grew restless. Dreams returned more frequently, visions of statues made of different metals, visions of heights and falls, voices that spoke not of glory, but of limits. And though he summoned interpreters and demanded answers, his anxiety deepened, because greatness without certainty is unbearable. He doubled down on control, expanded surveillance, tightened discipline, demanded stricter adherence to ritual, and punished defiance more harshly. Babylon glittered brighter than ever, but its brilliance cast long shadows. Shadows where paranoia grew, where the king's fear of losing control manifested as obsession. And history shows that when rulers begin to worship their own creations, they become prisoners of them. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was magnificent, unmatched, unforgettable. But it was also a monument to a single man's ego. An empire shaped not only by strategy and conquest, but by psychology, by insecurity, by the need to be eternal in a world that devours kings. And as the city reached its peak, as the walls stood firm and the temples gleamed, the foundations of Nebuchadnezzar's mind continued to fracture quietly, invisibly, preparing the ground for a collapse that would not begin with armies or rebellion, but with the unraveling of a king's identity. Because the more he tried to become divine, the further he drifted from what it meant to remain human. As Babylon glittered under Nebuchadnezzar's rule, the king himself began to experience a growing darkness that no amount of gold or stone could keep away. His nights were no longer peaceful. Sleep became interrupted by visions that felt heavier than ordinary dreams, images that lingered long after dawn. Statues towering into the sky made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay. Kingdoms rising and collapsing in sequence. Voices that spoke of power being given and taken away. And though Nebuchadnezzar ruled the world by day, at night he was no longer master of his own mind. These dreams disturbed him deeply because they threatened the single belief holding his identity together, the belief that his power was permanent, that his reign was divinely guaranteed. And so he reacted as rulers consumed by fear often do. By demanding answers, he summoned astrologers, magicians, diviners, and priests from every corner of his empire. Men trained to read the stars, the liver, the smoke, the omens of the gods. And he demanded certainty, not interpretation, but reassurance. Yet the very need for reassurance revealed weakness. Because a truly secure ruler does not fear questions about the future, Nebuchadnezzar did not ask whether the dreams were meaningful. He assumed they were, and that assumption alone showed how deeply anxiety had embedded itself within him. When his traditional advisors failed to provide the answers, he wanted his frustration turned to rage. Fear mixed with pride is volatile, and Nebuchadnezzar's court learned quickly that silence or hesitation could be fatal. Counselors spoke carefully, choosing words that pleased rather than warned, because honesty had become dangerous in this environment. Figures like Daniel emerged, outsiders whose interpretations challenged the king rather than affirmed him. And this terrified Nebuchadnezzar even more, because these interpretations suggested that power was conditional, that kings rose and fell by forces beyond their control, that even the greatest empire could be temporary. And Nebuchadnezzar heard these words not as spiritual insight, but as personal threats. He demanded loyalty not just in action, but in belief. And when belief wavered, punishment followed. Statues were erected, symbols of unity and obedience. And commands were issued that went beyond politics into worship. Obedience to the king's image became proof of loyalty to the state. And refusal became treason against the cosmic order Nebuchadnezzar believed he embodied. Yet each act of enforced reverence deepened the crack within him. Because worship demanded externally cannot quiet doubt internally. The more he demanded affirmation, the more fragile his confidence became. Paranoia began to shape his decisions. He watched his court closely, tested loyalty, interpreted disagreement as betrayal, and surrounded himself with those who praised him most loudly. Isolation followed naturally, because fear drives distance, and distance feeds delusion. The king who once moved among generals and architects now existed within ritual and ceremony, insulated from reality by layers of protocol. And as reality faded, symbols grew louder. Dreams intensified, repeating themes of ascent and collapse. Greatness followed by humiliation. Control followed by loss. And these visions struck at the core of Nebuchadnezzar's self-image. Because if the gods could humble him, then he was not divine. And that idea was unbearable. So he rejected it consciously, while subconsciously it consumed him. His waking behavior began to reflect the instability of his inner world. Mood shifts became noticeable. Moments of grand generosity followed by extreme cruelty, public declarations of confidence followed by private anxiety. Babylon continued to prosper, but its ruler was becoming unpredictable. Decisions were driven not only by strategy, but by emotional reaction. Punishment became more symbolic, more theatrical, designed to reinforce dominance rather than solve problems. And this theatricality revealed insecurity, because true strength does not need constant display. Nebuchadnezzar's fear of losing control extended to time itself. Anniversaries were marked obsessively, victories commemorated repeatedly, failures erased from record. History was rewritten to preserve an image of uninterrupted greatness. Yet even as he controlled the past, he could not control the future. And this imbalance weighed on him heavily. He sought refuge in ritual, increasing religious observances not out of devotion, but out of desperation. Priests performed ceremonies to stabilize the cosmos. Offerings increased, sacrifices multiplied. And yet the king's mind remained restless, because ritual without humility cannot bring peace. Dreams reached a climax when Nebuchadnezzar experienced visions not just of falling empires, but of himself reduced, stripped of authority, separated from humanity, living not as a king, but as something broken and wild. And these visions terrified him because they attacked not his empire, but his identity. He reacted by doubling down on grandeur, announcing his achievements publicly, walking the rooftops of Babylon, proclaiming its glory, speaking of his works, as if they were eternal proof of his greatness. And in these moments, his pride reached its peak. But pride at its peak often masks fear at its deepest. Because when a man must remind himself aloud of his greatness, he is already afraid of losing it. Nebuchadnezzar's mind stood at a crossroads, one path leading toward humility, acceptance, and balance, the other toward denial, obsession, and collapse. And the king chose denial, rejecting warning signs, silencing uncomfortable voices, elevating his image above all else. And history records that when leaders refuse to acknowledge limits, those limits enforce themselves, quietly at first, then suddenly. And as Nebuchadnezzar continued to rule with unmatched power, the unseen forces shaping his fate gathered strength, not armies or rebellions yet, but psychological pressure building within him. Dreams transforming into delusions, belief hardening into certainty, and certainty turning into madness. Because when a man believes he has become godlike, he begins to lose what makes him human. And Nebuchadnezzar was approaching the moment when the world he controlled would no longer matter. Because the greatest battle he faced was no longer against nations or kings, but against his own unraveling mind. By this point, Nebuchadnezzar was no longer merely ruling Babylon. He was performing himself as an idea, a living monument walking through a city built to reflect his greatness. The distance between the man and the myth had grown so wide that even he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Babylon had reached a level of wealth and security unseen in the ancient world. Enemies feared it, allies depended on it, and its walls stood as symbols of absolute dominance. And Nebuchadnezzar believed without hesitation that all of this existed because of him. He walked the elevated terraces and rooftops of the city, looking down upon temples, markets, canals, and palaces, and felt not responsibility, but ownership. He did not say the gods had blessed Babylon. He said Babylon proved his greatness. His language changed subtly but significantly. Praise once directed upward toward Marduk now flowed inward toward himself. The king began to speak as if the gods had acted through him because they could find no greater instrument. And this belief was no longer ceremonial or symbolic. It was personal, internal, absolute. He surrounded himself with symbols of permanence. Statues towering over crowds, inscriptions repeating his name endlessly, reliefs depicting his victories as cosmic events. And the more these images multiplied, the more his identity fused with them. Nebuchadnezzar was no longer satisfied with obedience. He demanded recognition, not just loyalty to Babylon, but admiration for himself. And this shift marked a dangerous psychological transformation. Because rulers who demand admiration are no longer securing power, they are feeding insecurity. The court felt this change immediately. Conversations became performances. Words were chosen carefully. Silence became safer than honesty. Praise became exaggerated. Fear replaced counsel. And Nebuchadnezzar interpreted agreement as wisdom and hesitation as betrayal. His judgment grew rigid, punishment harsher, mercy rare, because mercy suggests equality. And Nebuchadnezzar no longer saw himself as equal to other men. Religious life reflected this change as well. Worship became centralized and controlled. Rituals emphasized unity, obedience, and order. Dissent was framed as chaos, and chaos was framed as rebellion against the cosmic structure Nebuchadnezzar believed he embodied. Statues were raised not merely as symbols of the gods, but as extensions of the king's authority. And obedience to these symbols became tests of loyalty. When individuals refused, they were not treated as dissenters, but as threats to universal order. And Nebuchadnezzar responded with theatrical punishment, not only to eliminate opposition, but to reinforce the idea that defiance against him was defiance against reality itself. These acts were not strategic necessities, they were psychological assertions. Public demonstrations meant to silence doubt both in others and in himself. Yet the more he enforced reverence, the more restless he became. Because reverence imposed by fear cannot satisfy a mind craving certainty. Nebuchadnezzar's inner world grew louder. Dreams no longer felt symbolic. They felt intrusive, persistent, challenging his self-image directly. Visions of height followed by sudden fall, dominance followed by humiliation, greatness followed by isolation, and although he dismissed these visions publicly, they haunted him privately. Because somewhere beneath his arrogance lived the awareness that if power could be taken, then divinity was an illusion. and that thought threatened everything he believed about himself. So he rejected it aggressively, proclaiming his achievements loudly, walking through Babylon as if to reassure himself through sight, reminding himself and everyone else that this city existed because he willed it so. And in these moments, his pride reached its loudest volume. But pride at this level is not strength. It is armor, and armor worn constantly weighs down the mind. Nebuchadnezzar's behavior became increasingly performative. He staged moments of grandeur, demanded public displays of unity, enforced rituals that affirmed his central role in the universe. And yet, despite all this control, the anxiety never left. Because control over others does not equal control over fate. The king who once mastered war strategy now sought to master meaning itself, and meaning cannot be commanded. It can only be understood or rejected. Nebuchadnezzar chose rejection, dismissing warnings as weakness, interpreting humility as surrender, and viewing limitation as insult. He believed that acknowledging limits would unravel the entire structure of his authority, because his authority was built not on balance, but on excess. Excess power, excess confidence, excess belief in self. And history shows that systems built on excess do not bend, they break. The world around Nebuchadnezzar began to notice changes. Not rebellion yet, but whispers, observations that the king spoke differently, reacted unpredictably, isolated himself increasingly. Moments of clarity followed by moments of erratic decision, generosity followed by sudden cruelty. And these shifts unsettled those closest to him, because they recognized the signs of instability long before collapse, yet none dared speak openly, because the king no longer listened. He heard only affirmation or threat, and this sealed his isolation completely. Alone within a city of millions, surrounded by praise yet starving for truth, Nebuchadnezzar stood at the peak of human power and the edge of human collapse. His empire was secure, his walls strong, his armies unmatched. But his mind was no longer stable, and this imbalance made his downfall inevitable, because no empire collapses first through invasion. It collapses first through the erosion of judgment at its center. Nebuchadnezzar believed he had become godlike, and in believing that he lost the final anchor tying him to reality, the ability to recognize himself as human, subject to limits, accountable to something greater than his own reflection. And as he stood proudly overlooking Babylon, declaring its greatness as proof of his supremacy, unseen forces prepared to answer his arrogance not with armies or revolts, but with something far more devastating: the stripping away of his identity, his authority, and his sanity. Because when a man crowns himself God, the fall that follows is not political. It is personal, total, and irreversible. And Nebuchadnezzar was now standing at the precise moment before that fall began. The collapse of Nebuchadnezzar did not begin with rebellion or invasion. It began quietly within his own mind. Because when power isolates a ruler completely, the world stops correcting him. And without correction, belief hardens into delusion. The king who once commanded armies and shaped empires began to lose coherence. Moments of clarity fractured into confusion. Speech once precise became erratic. Authority once absolute began to feel distant even to himself. And those closest to him sensed the shift before history recorded it. Because madness rarely announces itself suddenly, it creeps, reshaping perception one thought at a time. Nebuchadnezzar's visions intensified, no longer symbolic dreams, but waking experiences, moments where reality blurred and identity dissolved. The king who believed himself divine began to perceive himself as something other than human, stripped of reason, stripped of dignity, stripped of the image he had built so carefully. And the court responded not with intervention, but with fear, because the king had punished truth to long for truth to return when it was needed most. Priests whispered explanations of divine judgment. Astrologers searched the stars for meaning. But none dared confront the reality unfolding before them. Nebuchadnezzar withdrew from public life gradually at first, canceling ceremonies, avoiding councils, isolating himself within the palace, and then suddenly, completely, disappearing from the visible machinery of power. His absence created confusion, but not rebellion, because the system he built was rigid enough to continue without him. A testament to his administrative strength, and a warning about how replaceable even the most powerful ruler can become. Accounts describe a period where Nebuchadnezzar lost all sense of royal identity, his mind rejecting the crown he once worshipped. He abandoned speech, abandoned reason, abandoned humanity itself, retreating into a state where instinct replaced intellect, where fear replaced command, where survival replaced control. The king who believed he stood above gods now existed beneath awareness, living not as ruler, but as exile within his own land, removed from court, removed from authority, removed from history while still alive. His body remained, but his identity vanished. And this transformation was more devastating than death. Because death preserves legacy while madness dismantles it publicly, privately, completely. The man who demanded worship now lived without recognition, without language, without the symbols that once defined him, and Babylon continued without him. Its walls still strong, its markets still busy, its rituals still performed, proving the most painful truth of all, that the empire did not need him to exist, that his belief in himself as the center of the world was an illusion. During this period, Nebuchadnezzar existed outside the structures he built, separated from human society, living as something wild and broken. His mind stripped of grandeur, reduced to instinct. The psychological weight of this fall cannot be overstated, because it was not imposed by enemies, but by the collapse of belief itself. The identity he had constructed through conquest and architecture could not survive without constant reinforcement. And when that reinforcement disappeared, the structure collapsed inward. Yet within this collapse lay a strange transformation. Because stripped of illusion, Nebuchadnezzar experienced a form of humility no conquest could produce. Without crown, without praise, without fear, without control, he confronted existence without power. Time passed not marked by ceremonies, but by seasons, his former self fading into memory, and slowly, imperceptibly, something changed. Accounts suggest a return, gradual and incomplete, a re-emergence of awareness, language returning hesitantly, recognition flickering uncertainly, the mind rebuilding itself not as ruler, but as man. And when Nebuchadnezzar finally returned to public life, he was no longer the same figure. the arrogance that once defined him, had been shattered. His speech reflected restraint rather than certainty, acknowledgement rather than declaration. The man who once claimed supremacy now spoke of limits, of forces greater than himself, of humility learned not through instruction, but through erasure. His authority was restored, but his worldview transformed. And this transformation carried a message far more powerful than any monument he built, because it demonstrated that power, unchecked, destroys the self, that identity built on dominance collapses when dominance fades. Nebuchadnezzar's later reign lacked the theatrical arrogance of earlier years. His decisions more measured, his tone subdued, his focus less on expansion and more on stability. Yet the shadow of his collapse never left him, because once a ruler experiences powerlessness completely, he can never fully forget it. The fear that once drove him toward godhood now anchored him in caution. And though Babylon remained magnificent, its future was already uncertain, because empires reflect the psychology of their rulers. And Nebuchadnezzar's transformation marked the beginning of Babylon's quiet decline, not through weakness, but through the exhaustion of excess. The king who believed himself divine learned through madness what no philosopher could teach him. That power without humility is self-destructs, that authority without balance becomes isolation, and that the greatest fall is not from throne to grave, but from identity to nothingness. Nebuchadnezzar survived his madness, but the man who emerged was no longer the god he once believed himself to be. He was human again, and that realization, earned through humiliation rather than wisdom, stands as the most haunting chapter of his life, because it reveals that even the greatest kings are fragile beneath their crowns, and that the mind, once broken by absolute power, never fully returns to what it was before. When Nebuchadnezzar returned to the world of men, he did not return as a conqueror reborn, but as a survivor reshaped by absence. The court saw him again, yet did not fully recognize him, because the presence that re-entered Babylon carried a weight very different from the one that had vanished. The arrogance that once filled rooms before he spoke was gone, replaced by a careful silence, measured steps, restrained words. The king who once announced his greatness now listened more than he spoke, and this change unsettled those around him more than his earlier fury ever had. Because power expressed quietly is harder to predict than power expressed loudly, Nebuchadnezzar resumed his place on the throne not through ceremony, but necessity. The empire required a figurehead, and the machinery of rule welcomed him back. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The crown no longer felt like proof of divinity. It felt heavy, fragile, conditional. And this awareness altered the way he ruled. He no longer demanded worship. He accepted authority with caution, as if aware that identity could dissolve again. If built too rigidly, his language reflected this transformation. Speeches that once centered on his achievements now referenced forces greater than any king. Acknowledgements of order beyond human control. Expressions that suggested humility not as performance, but as survival. Those closest to him noticed that he avoided elevated vantage points. The rooftops where he once proclaimed Babylon as evidence of his supremacy now held uncomfortable memories, reminders of how quickly certainty can collapse, and so his rule entered a quieter phase. Not weak but restrained, the empire still stood strong, yet its center no longer radiated unchecked ambition. Nebuchadnezzar focused on preservation rather than expansion, stability rather than spectacle. He reinforced systems rather than monuments, delegated more authority, trusted advisors cautiously, and reduced the theatrical rituals that had once defined his reign. Yet regret followed him closely, because memory does not fade simply because power returns. The years of absence haunted him. The knowledge that Babylon had continued without him forced him to confront a painful truth: that he was not indispensable, that his belief in himself as the axis of the world had been an illusion sustained by fear and ritual. This realization reshaped his understanding of kingship. Authority became responsibility rather than entitlement, and responsibility brought with it the weight of consequence. He reflected on the suffering he had caused: the cities broken, the people displaced, the punishments inflicted to reinforce obedience. And while history does not record open apologies or reversals, it does record restraint, a slowing of cruelty, a softening of response. A ruler who no longer sought to dominate identity itself. The court adapted slowly, learning new rhythms, flatter hierarchies, less theatrical displays, more administrative focus. Babylon remained magnificent, but its glow changed, less blinding, more enduring. Yet beneath this calmer surface lay the constant awareness of mortality. Nebuchadnezzar now understood something he had once denied completely: that power ends, that identity fades, that legacy is fragile, and this awareness shadowed his remaining years. He became increasingly reflective, consulting records, histories, inscriptions, perhaps seeking to understand how kings before him had fallen. Assyria's ruins were no longer distant warnings. They were mirrors, reminders that permanence is illusion. Even the greatest empires vanish when belief outpaces balance. Nebuchadnezzar's personal transformation influenced the empire subtly. Ambition cooled. The urgency that once drove Babylon outward slowed. And this created space for future weakness. Because empires built on momentum require constant expansion to sustain their myth. And Babylon's myth had shifted from unstoppable force to inherited greatness, a quieter but more fragile state. Nebuchadnezzar aged visibly. The weight of years pressed upon him more heavily than before. Because once a man experiences powerlessness, age no longer feels abstract. It feels approaching, unavoidable. He spent more time in reflection than in display, more time with priests than generals, not seeking validation, but understanding. And while some interpreted this as wisdom, others saw it as retreat. The world around Babylon was changing as well. Rival powers observed quietly, alliances shifted, strength measured differently. And though Nebuchadnezzar remained respected, his aura of inevitability had diminished. Fear once commanded obedience instantly. Now it required reinforcement. And reinforcement always signals decline. The king sensed this, not intellectually, but instinctively, because once illusion collapses, instinct becomes sharper. He understood that his empire would not last forever, that successors would inherit, not his personal authority, but the structures he left behind. And structures without vision often decay. Yet he did not attempt to reclaim his former dominance. Because the cost of doing so was too clear. He had paid it once with his identity, and he would not pay it again. Nebuchadnezzar's later reign became a study in restraint shaped by trauma, a ruler haunted by his own excess, ruling carefully, not because he lacked power, but because he understood its danger. And this understanding became his final legacy, not the walls, not the gardens, not the conquests, but the lesson carved into his own life, that kings who attempt to rise above humanity are inevitably dragged back into it, often violently, sometimes mercifully, but always completely. Nebuchadnezzar lived the rest of his days under this shadow, aware that greatness achieved without humility is temporary, and that the true measure of power is not how high a ruler stands, but whether he can survive the fall when it comes. Because survival with awareness changes everything, and Nebuchadnezzar survived. Not as a god, not as a myth, but as a man who had seen the limits of power and lived long enough to understand them. And in that understanding lay both his redemption and the quiet beginning of Babylon's end. As Nebuchadnezzar entered the final phase of his life, his rule no longer moved with the force of inevitability, but with the caution of memory, the fire that once drove him to conquer and construct without restraint had cooled into something quieter and more fragile. His authority remained unquestioned, yet it no longer inspired the same awe or fear. Because awe is born from momentum, and momentum had slowed. The king spent increasing amounts of time away from public spectacle, delegating more responsibility to officials and heirs while observing rather than commanding. And this withdrawal was not sudden, but gradual, a retreat shaped by awareness rather than weakness. Nebuchadnezzar understood now that empires do not collapse only through invasion. They weaken first through transition, through uncertainty about who comes next and what vision will guide the future. Succession weighed heavily on his thoughts, because unlike conquest, succession cannot be enforced through fear alone. It requires legitimacy, continuity, and belief. And belief was something Nebuchadnezzar himself had learned could dissolve. His sons and potential successors stood in his shadow, measured constantly against a figure too large to imitate yet too dominant to escape. And this created tension within the court. Factions formed quietly, loyalties shifted subtly. Not yet rebellions, but alignments preparing for a future without the man who had defined Babylon. For decades, Nebuchadnezzar watched these developments closely, aware that the unity he once commanded through presence now depended on structures alone. And structures without living authority are vulnerable. The empire remained wealthy, its walls still formidable, its rituals intact. Yet the psychological center that had driven its expansion was gone. Babylon was no longer moving forward aggressively. It was maintaining itself. And maintenance is the first sign of decline for empires built on conquest. The king reflected, often on Assyria's fall, a cautionary tale he could no longer dismiss. Assyria had believed itself eternal, had ruled through terror and dominance, had built monuments and enforced obedience, and yet it collapsed suddenly when belief fractured. Nebuchadnezzar recognized parallels he once ignored, and this recognition filled him with quiet urgency. He attempted to strengthen administration, codify procedures, reinforce economic stability. But systems cannot replace vision. They can only preserve it temporarily. And vision had been inseparable from Nebuchadnezzar himself. The court sensed this absence even if they could not name it. Rituals continued but felt hollow. Ceremonies performed but lacked conviction. Because belief cannot be inherited mechanically, it must be experienced. And Nebuchadnezzar's successors had not experienced the rise, only the stability that followed it. This created a dangerous illusion, the belief that Babylon's strength was natural rather than earned, and Nebuchadnezzar feared this illusion deeply. Because he knew how fragile naturalized power truly is, his health began to decline. Not dramatically, but visibly, age marked him more clearly now. The body reminding him daily of what the mind had already accepted. That time moves regardless of power, that kings age like all men. And this awareness sharpened his concern for legacy. Not legacy in monuments, but legacy in survival. He questioned whether Babylon could endure without him, whether the systems he built could withstand leaders without his authority, whether the empire could survive rulers who had not learned humility through loss. Because humility learned without suffering rarely holds. And Nebuchadnezzar's own humility had been carved into him. Through erasure, not education, he attempted to guide successors subtly, through example rather than command, emphasizing restraint, balance, respect for forces beyond human control. Yet such lessons are difficult to transmit when power remains unchallenged. The court listened respectfully but selectively. Ambition does not vanish simply because an older ruler grows cautious. Younger elites still dreamed of expansion, glory, and dominance, unaware of the psychological cost such dreams demand. And Nebuchadnezzar saw in them echoes of his former self, a reflection that filled him with both recognition and dread. Because he knew where that path could lead. Foreign powers watched Babylon carefully during this period. Alliances shifted quietly. Rivals tested boundaries, probing for weakness. And while no immediate threat emerged, the geopolitical balance was changing. Babylon was no longer the terrifying force it once was. It was respected, admired, but no longer feared unconditionally, and fear had been its greatest weapon. Without it, diplomacy became more complex. Negotiation replaced submission, and negotiation introduces risk. Nebuchadnezzar understood this shift instinctively. Even if others dismissed it as paranoia, he felt the empire settling into complacency, a dangerous comfort that often precedes collapse. His final years were marked by reflection rather than action, observation rather than intervention. He spent time reviewing records, inscriptions, histories, perhaps attempting to understand his place within the larger pattern of rise and fall. Kings before him had risen, ruled, and vanished. And now he recognized himself as part of that cycle rather than its exception. This acceptance shaped his final worldview, not bitter, not triumphant, but sober. The man who once declared himself godlike now understood that even gods in stories fall. The difference between myth and history lies in permanence, and history erases all eventually. Nebuchadnezzar's death did not come with dramatic collapse or rebellion. It came quietly, as power often ends when its time has passed. The throne passed to successors who inherited the city, the walls, the wealth, but not the aura, not the psychological authority, not the fear that had once held the world in place. And this absence would shape Babylon's future more than any external enemy. Because empires do not crumble the moment a great ruler dies. They crumble when the belief that sustained them fades. And Nebuchadnezzar's final years marked the beginning of that fade. Not through failure, but through transformation, his journey from conqueror to cautionary figure left Babylon stronger in structure, but weaker in spirit. Prepared to survive, but not to dominate. And history would soon test whether survival without dominance was enough. Because the world Nebuchadnezzar had shaped would not remain still, new powers would rise. Old rivals would return, and Babylon would face challenges it could no longer intimidate into submission. Nebuchadnezzar sensed this future approaching, not clearly, but intuitively, and in that intuition lay the quiet tragedy of his final years. The knowledge that he had built something extraordinary, that he had ruled the world, that he had learned humility at unimaginable cost, and yet that none of it guaranteed permanence, because no matter how high a king rises, no matter how strong a city becomes, history always moves forward, indifferent to pride, monuments, or belief. And Nebuchadnezzar's life, once defined by ascent, ended defined by understanding, the understanding that power is temporary, identity fragile, and empires mortal, and that this truth, once learned, cannot be unlearned, only lived with, until the end. Nebuchadnezzar's death did not arrive with thunder or prophecy. It came quietly, almost anticlimactically, as if history itself wished to remind the world that even the most powerful lives end not in spectacle, but in silence. The man who had once commanded the fate of nations, who had rebuilt Babylon into the most magnificent city on earth, who had believed himself chosen, even godlike, passed from the world without resistance, without drama, without the universe bending in acknowledgement, and this quiet ending carried a meaning deeper than any conquest, because it revealed the final truth Nebuchadnezzar had learned too late. That power does not pause when a king dies, it simply moves on. The court responded as courts always do. With ritual, order, and controlled emotion, mourning ceremonies were held, praises were spoken, accomplishments recited, inscriptions prepared to preserve memory. The image of Nebuchadnezzar as conqueror, builder, restorer was carefully curated. His years of madness softened, his humility reframed as wisdom, his decline presented as dignified transition. Because history written by institutions seeks stability, not truth, and Babylon needed stability above all else, the succession proceeded. Smoothly on the surface, the throne passed to his heirs. The machinery of government continued uninterrupted. Officials retained their positions. Soldiers remained at their posts. Markets opened. Temples functioned. The city breathed as it always had, and to many observers this continuity appeared reassuring, proof that Babylon was more than one man, proof that the empire Nebuchadnezzar built could endure beyond him. But beneath this surface lay an illusion, because continuity of structure is not continuity of power. And what Babylon had lost was not administrative capacity, but psychological gravity. Nebuchadnezzar had been the axis around which belief revolved. His presence alone had commanded fear, and obedience across the ancient world. His name carried weight that no successor could inherit fully. Successors inherit thrones, but not aura, and aura cannot be legislated. It must be earned through moment, conquest, and myth. The men who followed Nebuchadnezzar inherited an empire, already at rest, not in motion, and empires at rest are vulnerable. Because momentum creates obedience while stability invites challenge. Foreign powers watched carefully, noting that the figure who had defined Babylon for decades was gone. Alliances that once held out of fear began to reconsider. Tributary states tested boundaries subtly, not with rebellion yet, but with hesitation, delayed payments, diplomatic ambiguity. And these small shifts signaled larger changes to come. Within, the court new dynamics emerged, factions strengthened, rivalries sharpened. Because the unifying force of Nebuchadnezzar's authority was absent, decisions once settled by a single voice now required negotiation, compromise, and persuasion. And compromise weakens empires built on dominance. The successors attempted to rule in his image, invoking his legacy, referencing his victories, surrounding themselves with symbols of his reign. But imitation without experience rings hollow. Because authority grounded in memory lacks immediacy, subjects obeyed out of habit rather than fear, and habit erodes over time. The rituals continued. Priests invoked Marduk's favor. Festivals celebrated Babylon's greatness. But belief began to thin. Not vanish, just weaken. And weakened belief is the most dangerous state for any empire, because it invites doubt while pretending strength. Nebuchadnezzar's absence also removed the restraint he had developed in his later years. Successors lacked his hard-earned humility. Some sought to reclaim former glory aggressively. Others retreated into complacency. Neither approach restored the balance Nebuchadnezzar had achieved after his collapse. The psychological cohesion of the empire fractured slowly, invisibly. Administrators still functioned, but vision faded. Soldiers still trained, but purpose dulled. Citizens still worked, but pride softened. And this internal shift mattered more than any external threat. Because empires fall when they no longer believe in themselves consistently, the illusion of continuity persisted for years, supported by Babylon's immense walls, its wealth, its central position in trade and culture. Travelers still marveled at the city. Stories of its grandeur continued to circulate. And yet the myth of invincibility that once surrounded it had cracked. People remembered that Nebuchadnezzar himself had fallen, that the king who believed himself divine had been reduced to nothing. And if that could happen to him, then no ruler was untouchable. This memory lingered quietly in collective consciousness, shaping attitudes subtly, reducing fear, encouraging calculation, and calculation leads to resistance. Babylon's neighbors learned patience, waiting rather than confronting, observing rather than attacking, because time itself had become their ally. Within Babylon, debates intensified about the direction of the empire, whether to expand or consolidate, dominate or negotiate. And these debates reflected uncertainty rather than strength. Nebuchadnezzar had not needed debate. His were defined direction. Without him, the empire hesitated, and hesitation creates opportunity for rivals. The illusion of continuity masked a deeper truth. that Nebuchadnezzar's reign had been the culmination of Babylon's rise, not the foundation of its future. His successors inherited a peak, and peaks do not allow upward movement, only descent or stagnation. And stagnation in a competitive world is decline. The psychological shock of his death also affected religious interpretation. Priests struggled to frame his life coherently. A king chosen by gods who had fallen into madness and then returned humbled. This narrative complicated simple theology. Belief systems thrive on clarity, and Nebuchadnezzar's life introduced ambiguity. Ambiguity weakens absolutism, and absolutism had been Babylon's ideological core. Gradually, belief shifted from certainty to tradition, from conviction to routine, and routine lacks defensive power. Nebuchadnezzar's legacy thus became paradoxical. He left behind unmatched structures, wealth, and administrative systems. But he also left behind a lesson that undermined absolute authority. The lesson that even the greatest king is fragile, that power does not guarantee permanence, that identity built on dominance collapses under its own weight, and this lesson spread quietly, shaping the mindset of subjects and rivals alike. The empire continued, but its center of gravity drifted. No longer anchored by a single commanding presence, Babylon entered a new era, one defined not by explosive growth, but by maintenance, negotiation, and quiet erosion. And history shows that empires do not collapse the moment a great ruler dies. They collapse when the belief that sustained them dissipates. And that dissipation had begun the moment Nebuchadnezzar's voice fell silent. His death marked not the end of Babylon, but the end of its certainty. And certainty once lost is never fully recovered. The illusion of continuity sustained the empire temporarily, but beneath it history was already moving, patient, inevitable, preparing to test whether Babylon without Nebuchadnezzar could withstand a world that no longer feared it absolutely. And that test would come not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a slow unraveling, proving that the true end of Nebuchadnezzar's story was not his death, but the gradual fading of the world he had shaped around himself. After Nebuchadnezzar, the world did not immediately change its shape. Babylon still stood tall. Its walls still cast long shadows. Its gates still dazzled travelers. And its name still carried echoes of terror and wonder. Yet something essential had vanished, not visible in stone or ceremony, but felt in behavior, in hesitation, in tone. The empire continued to function, but it no longer dominated the psychology of the ancient world. Power without fear is authority without gravity, and gravity is what had kept Babylon at the center of everything. Nebuchadnezzar's successors inherited a city that looked invincible but felt uncertain. They ruled from the same palaces, issued commands through the same channels, presided over the same rituals. Yet obedience no longer arrived automatically. It required explanation, reassurance, sometimes concession, and concession erodes dominance. Foreign envoys arrived with confidence they had never shown before. Negotiations replaced submission. Tribute became bargaining. Alliances shifted from loyalty to convenience. And Babylon's leadership sensed this shift even if they refused to name it. The fear that once preceded Babylon's armies was gone, replaced by calculation and calculation. is dangerous for empires built on intimidation. Within the court, power fragmented. No single ruler commanded the unquestioned authority Nebuchadnezzar had wielded. Factions gained influence. Rival advisors competed. Decisions slowed. Debates multiplied. And while debate is healthy for republics, it weakens autocracies that rely on decisiveness. Babylon's rulers attempted to compensate through ritual and symbolism, invoking Nebuchadnezzar's legacy repeatedly, surrounding themselves with his imagery, speaking his name as if repetition could restore the past. But symbols cannot replace presence, and memory cannot recreate fear. The population sensed this as well. Loyalty shifted subtly from reverence to routine. Obedience became habit rather than belief, and habits decay over time. Economically, Babylon remained strong, but prosperity bred complacency. The urgency that once drove expansion faded. Trade routes remained active, but competitors grew bolder. Smaller states began asserting independence quietly, not through rebellion, but through autonomy. Reducing Babylon's influence without direct confrontation, religious authority also shifted. Priests struggled to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's life and fall coherently. A king chosen by the gods, who had been humbled so completely challenged simplistic theology. Belief systems thrive on clarity, uncertainty, and ambiguity weakens them. The gods no longer seemed to guarantee Babylon's dominance. They appeared conditional, distant, negotiable, and this perception undermined the ideological foundation of empire. Because Babylon had not ruled solely through armies, but through the belief that resistance was futile. Once that belief weakened, resistance became thinkable. The successors attempted reforms, some focusing on consolidation, others dreaming of renewed conquest, but none possessed the psychological authority to unify vision and action. Military campaigns lacked the overwhelming decisiveness of Nebuchadnezzar's wars. Victories felt defensive rather than transformative. Losses felt heavier. Morale shifted. Soldiers still fought, but without the conviction that victory was inevitable. And inevitability had been Babylon's greatest weapon. The empire entered a phase of quiet erosion. Not dramatic collapse, but gradual thinning. Influence receded at the edges. Loyalty became transactional. Power dispersed, and time began working against Babylon rather than for it. Rivals observed patiently, understanding that empires do not need to be destroyed when they are willing to weaken themselves. Among these rivals, Persia emerged as a new force, disciplined, strategic, ideologically coherent, offering a different model of power, one that promised order without terror, inclusion rather than annihilation. And this contrast mattered deeply, because Babylon's model had been built on fear and spectacle. Without Nebuchadnezzar's presence, that model lost credibility. Subjects compared systems. Elites calculated advantage, and loyalty shifted quietly. Babylon's rulers attempted to project strength, but projection without substance fails over time. The walls still stood, but walls cannot stop ideas, and ideas were moving faster than armies. The idea that Babylon was eternal faded into the idea that Babylon was simply another power, strong but mortal. The illusion of continuity fractured further as internal disputes intensified. Succession struggles weakened cohesion, and confidence eroded. Each new ruler felt smaller than the last, not because they were incompetent, but because they ruled a myth past its peak. The empire's greatest achievement had been creating the belief that it was unavoidable. Once that belief dissolved, avoidance became possible. Diplomacy replaced fear, treaties replaced terror, and Babylon found itself negotiating its own survival. Something Nebuchadnezzar would never have tolerated. Culturally, the city remained influential, but cultural influence without political dominance invites imitation. Rather than obedience, others learned from Babylon without submitting to it, spreading its ideas while rejecting its authority. And this diffusion marked the beginning of the end, because when power spreads, it loses its center. Nebuchadnezzar's life loomed over this era like a shadow. His achievements remembered, his madness whispered, his humility acknowledged, but his presence absent. And absence is fatal to systems built on personality. Babylon had been shaped by one man's will, ambition, fear, and transformation. Without that, the system drifted. And drifting empires eventually collide with forces more focused than themselves. The rulers who followed Nebuchadnezzar inherited greatness without momentum, strength without myth, power without fear, and history shows that such inheritances rarely endure. Because empires survive not on what they are, but on what people believe they are. Babylon was still magnificent, but it was no longer inevitable. And inevitability, once lost, cannot be reclaimed through ceremony or force. It must be rebuilt through vision, and vision died with Nebuchadnezzar, leaving behind a city unmatched in beauty, yet unmatched in vulnerability, standing tall in stone while quietly collapsing in meaning. And as the world adjusted to this new reality, the stage was set for the final test, not of Babylon's walls or wealth, but of whether an empire that had lost its psychological dominance could survive in a world that no longer feared it, because fear had been the foundation of everything Nebuchadnezzar built. And without fear, Babylon was simply powerful. And in the ancient world, simply powerful was never enough. As Babylon struggled to define itself after Nebuchadnezzar, a new power was rising quietly to the east. One that did not announce itself with terror or spectacle, but with discipline, patience, and coherence. Persia did not emerge suddenly. It grew steadily, absorbing strength rather than displaying it, learning from the mistakes of empires before it. And this difference mattered deeply, because Babylon's power had been psychological as much as military, built on the belief that resistance was futile, that Babylon's dominance was inevitable. But inevitability requires constant reinforcement, and Persia understood this. While Babylon relied on memory, Persia invested in momentum. Its leaders unified tribes, organized administration, and crafted an ideology that promised order without annihilation. Cyrus of Persia did not present himself as a destroyer, but as a liberator, and this framing proved devastating to Babylon's self-image. Because fear collapses when a rival offers security, Babylon's rulers underestimated this shift, believing walls, wealth, and tradition would protect them. But walls do not stop ideas, and ideas were moving faster than armies. Persia's expansion was methodical, strategic, and restrained. Cities surrendered not out of terror, but calculation. Elites chose cooperation over resistance. Populations welcomed stability over oppression. And Babylon's reputation as an unforgiving empire worked against it. Because once fear faded, memory turned into resentment. Babylon's former subjects remembered deportations, punishments, humiliation, and when presented with an alternative, they chose change. Babylon still appeared invincible from within. Rituals continued, festivals celebrated ancient glory, priests invoked Marduk's protection. Yet belief had shifted. The gods no longer guaranteed dominance. They required negotiation, and negotiation undermines absolutism. Babylon's leadership debated responses but lacked clarity. Some advocated confrontation, others diplomacy, still others denial, and this indecision revealed weakness. Nebuchadnezzar would have acted decisively. His successors hesitated, and hesitation invites challenge. Persia advanced not as a raging force, but as an inevitability born of organization. Babylon's allies drifted away quietly, not declaring betrayal, but failing to appear when needed. Tribute slowed, borders softened, influence receded, and the illusion of permanence cracked further. The psychological center of power shifted. Eastward, even before Babylon fell physically, it fell conceptually. People stopped believing it could not be challenged, and that belief mattered more than walls. Inside Babylon, complacency mixed with denial. The city had survived Assyria, had outlived countless rivals, and many assumed it would survive Persia as well. Because tradition can become blindness. History teaches that empires fall not when they are weakest materially, but when they are strongest in illusion. And Babylon's illusion was intact among its elites even as it crumbled externally. Persia's ideology exploited this perfectly, offering respect for local customs, religious tolerance, and administrative continuity. Babylon's subjects compared systems and chose pragmatism. Fear no longer outweighed advantage. The gods of Babylon did not strike Persia down. The heavens did not intervene. And each passing moment without divine response weakened confidence further. The psychological warfare was subtle but devastating. Babylon's defenders expected siege, fire, blood. But what approached was patience, planning, inevitability of a different kind. And inevitability always defeats spectacle. Nebuchadnezzar's legacy haunted this moment. Because his empire had been built on dominance rather than adaptability, on fear rather than integration, and when fear evaporated, nothing replaced it. Persia filled that vacuum not through brutality, but through order. Babylon's leaders attempted to rally belief, invoking Nebuchadnezzar's name, his walls, his gods. But names do not stop change. Walls do not protect against irrelevance, and gods lose authority when they fail to act. The city's confidence eroded quietly. Fear replaced pride. Not fear of invasion, but fear of meaninglessness. The realization that Babylon was no longer central, no longer the axis of the world. And this realization destabilized everything. Soldiers doubted, officials calculated, priests hesitated, and hesitations spread like infection. Persia advanced steadily, absorbing territory, isolating Babylon diplomatically and economically. And when the moment came, Babylon stood alone, not because it lacked allies, but because it no longer inspired loyalty. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon had ruled through certainty, certainty that it would punish defiance, certainty that it could not be resisted, certainty that it was chosen. That certainty was gone, replaced by uncertainty about whether Babylon still mattered. And once an empire begins asking that question, the answer is already forming. The fall of Babylon was no longer a question of if, but when. Not because Persia was invincible, but because Babylon had lost the belief that once made it untouchable. And this marked the true end of Nebuchadnezzar's world. Not with the breach of walls, but with the collapse of illusion. Because empires are sustained by stories as much as armies. And Babylon's story no longer convinced anyone, not its enemies, not its subjects, not even itself. Persia rose not by destroying Babylon immediately, but by making it obsolete. And history shows that obsolescence is more powerful than destruction. Because destruction creates martyrs, while obsolescence creates silence. And silence is the final state of fallen empires. Nebuchadnezzar's legacy thus reached its final contradiction. The man who believed himself divine built a city so magnificent that it survived him materially. Yet his inability to build a flexible identity ensured that the empire could not survive a world that changed. Persia did not just defeat Babylon. It replaced the idea that Babylon represented. And when ideas are replaced, stone soon follows. The stage was now set for the final act, the physical fall of Babylon itself. Not as a dramatic collapse, but as the quiet conclusion of a story already decided. Because long before Cyrus entered the city, Babylon had already lost what made it powerful, the belief that it was unavoidable. And once that belief died, the rest was inevitable.
When Babylon finally fell, it did not fall in flames the way Assyria had. It did not echo with screams or collapse beneath relentless siege engines. Instead, it surrendered to silence, calculation, and inevitability. And that quiet ending was far more devastating than any battlefield defeat, because it revealed just how completely the city had lost the force that once defined it. Babylon stood behind walls that were still massive, still intimidating, still capable of resisting a traditional assault. Yet those walls now guarded a hollow certainty, the belief that they would never be tested, because the world no longer feared them enough to try. Persia approached not as a conqueror hungry for destruction, but as a solution to a problem Babylon no longer knew how to solve. Cyrus did not rush. He waited, observed, understood. He recognized that Babylon's greatest weakness was not its defenses, but its mindset. Its elites believed themselves protected by tradition and reputation. Its population was weary of spectacle and oppression. Its priests uncertain of divine favor. Its soldiers confident in stone but unsure in purpose. And this uncertainty opened the gates more effectively than any battering ram. Accounts describe a city celebrating even as its fate approached. Festivals continued, rituals were performed. Confidence projected outward even as meaning drained inward. This was not denial born of ignorance, but denial born of habit. Babylon had always survived, and survival had become assumption rather than achievement. The Persians exploited this perfectly, diverting waterways, repositioning forces, advancing methodically while Babylon watched but did not act, because acting would have required belief that action was necessary, and belief had eroded. When Persian forces finally entered the city, they did so not through shattered gates, but through opportunity. Resistance was minimal, coordination absent, command fragmented. Babylon did not rise to defend itself because it no longer knew what it was defending. The idea of Babylon as the center of the world had already collapsed. What remained was stone and ceremony, and stone cannot fight for meaning. The city that once dictated the fate of nations found itself negotiated rather than conquered, absorbed rather than annihilated, and this absorption marked the final humiliation. Because destruction preserves dignity, while absorption erases identity. Cyrus presented himself not as destroyer but as restorer, honoring local customs, respecting temples, allowing continuity. And this strategy stripped Babylon of its final defense, the claim that resistance was necessary to preserve culture. Culture was preserved, but authority was gone. Babylon's gods were not destroyed, they were sidelined. Babylon's elites were not executed, they were incorporated. Babylon's people were not enslaved, they were reassigned. And this administrative mercy disguised a total loss of sovereignty. The city remained, but the empire vanished. And this disappearance felt unreal to those who lived through it, because nothing appeared broken. Nothing burned, nothing screamed, yet everything had changed. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon had ended not with a roar, but with a whisper. And that whisper echoed longer than fire ever could. The psychological impact of this fall was profound. A city that had defined itself through dominance now existed through accommodation. A people raised to fear Babylon now lived without that fear. And fear once removed cannot be reinstated easily. The illusion of invincibility shattered completely, revealing the truth Nebuchadnezzar had learned too late, that power built on belief collapses when belief withdraws. The priest struggled to explain this outcome. Gods had not intervened, rituals had not protected, prophecy had not prevented, and theology fractured under the weight of reality. If Babylon could fall quietly, then divine favor was not absolute. Kings were not guaranteed, and empires were not eternal. This realization reshaped how people understood authority, faith, and history itself. Babylon's walls stood. Its streets bustled, its markets functioned. But its role as the axis of the world was finished. It became a province, a memory, a lesson. And this transition was more devastating than destruction because it denied Babylon the dignity of tragedy. There was no final stand to immortalize, no heroic resistance to remember. Only compliance and continuity under new masters. And this outcome reframed Nebuchadnezzar's entire legacy. The man who believed himself divine had built a city so strong that it did not need to be destroyed to be defeated. And that strength became weakness because it encouraged complacency. The structures he built outlived his ideology but could not sustain it. Babylon became a symbol not of eternal power, but of how power ends when meaning dissolves. The Persians ruled efficiently, respectfully, strategically. And Babylon adapted because adaptation had become survival. The city that once refused to bow now bent easily. Not out of fear but pragmatism, and pragmatism is the language of the defeated. This fall reshaped the ancient world. It signaled the end of empires built purely on terror and spectacle, and the rise of systems built on administration, tolerance, and integration. Nebuchadnezzar's world ended not because it was weak, but because it was rigid, unable to evolve beyond the psychology that created it. And rigidity in a changing world is fatal. The fall of Babylon without a battle stands as one of history's most sobering lessons. That empires do not always collapse under force. Sometimes they dissolve under relevance, slipping quietly into the past while life continues uninterrupted. And this quiet ending ensured that Nebuchadnezzar's story would not be remembered as a heroic tragedy, but as a cautionary transformation. From absolute power to silent obsolescence, from God-king to historical footnote, the city he built endured physically, but lost its soul. And that loss was irreversible. Babylon survived, but it no longer ruled. And in that distinction lies the true meaning of its fall. Because the greatest defeat is not destruction, it is irrelevance. And Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon became irrelevant not because it was conquered, but because the world no longer needed what it represented. When history finally stepped back to judge Nebuchadnezzar, it did not speak with a single voice. because figures like him fracture memory itself. Some remembered him as the greatest king Babylon ever produced, a builder of wonders, a conqueror who reshaped the ancient world, a ruler under whom Babylon reached heights never seen before or since. Others remembered him as a tyrant, a destroyer of cities, a breaker of peoples, a man whose pride eclipsed mercy. And these conflicting images did not cancel each other out. They existed together, layered, inseparable. Because Nebuchadnezzar was not one thing, he was a process, a transformation, a living example of how power evolves when left unchecked. Ancient inscriptions praised him relentlessly, portraying him as chosen by the gods, restorer of order, protector of Babylon, and these records were not lies. They reflected how he was seen in his time, but they were also propaganda, designed to reinforce belief rather than record complexity. Later religious traditions framed him differently. As a warning, a king whose arrogance invited divine correction, a ruler humbled when he mistook authority for divinity. And this portrayal shifted focus from his achievements to his psychology. From what he built to what he became, historians approached him with colder distance, examining administrative brilliance, military strategy, urban planning, and geopolitical impact, acknowledging his genius while refusing to excuse his cruelty. And this tension defines his legacy. Because Nebuchadnezzar forces history to confront an uncomfortable truth, that greatness and destruction often emerge from the same source, that the qualities which build empires are often the same qualities that unravel the minds of those who lead them. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar was extraordinary. Its walls, its gates, its temples, its wealth, its cultural gravity shaped the imagination of the ancient world. And even after its political fall, Babylon remained a symbol, a reference point, a memory that refused to disappear. Yet Nebuchadnezzar himself became increasingly symbolic, less a man and more a lesson. His life compressed into narratives that emphasized transformation, rise and fall, pride and humility, power and madness. Because history seeks meaning as much as accuracy. And Nebuchadnezzar provided meaning in abundance. His madness became central to how later generations understood him. Not because it defined his reign, but because it revealed its cost. The image of a king stripped of reason resonated deeply, because it exposed the fragility beneath absolute authority. It suggested that no matter how vast an empire becomes, the human mind remains vulnerable. And vulnerability at the center of power destabilizes everything built around it. Nebuchadnezzar's building projects were unmatched, yet they became ruins. His laws were enforced, yet they faded. His conquests were decisive, yet they reversed. What endured was not stone or territory, but narrative. The story of a man who believed himself godlike and learned otherwise, and this story transcended culture, appearing in religious texts, philosophical discussions, historical analysis, and collective memory, because it addressed a universal anxiety, the fear that power corrupts not only institutions but identity, that ruling others can distort the self, and Nebuchadnezzar embodied that fear fully. His legacy also forced re-evaluation of Babylon itself. Once viewed simply as a city of decadence or oppression, it became understood as a complex civilization, administratively advanced, culturally rich, intellectually influential, and Nebuchadnezzar's reign highlighted this complexity. He was not merely a destroyer, he was also a preserver, collecting knowledge, rebuilding temples, standardizing systems, and yet preservation under domination carries moral cost. Knowledge gathered through conquest still bears the shadow of violence, and history cannot ignore that shadow. Nebuchadnezzar's successors struggled beneath this legacy, unable to replicate his authority, yet burdened by his memory. And this illustrates another historical truth, that extraordinary rulers often leave behind systems that depend too heavily on their personal presence, making continuity difficult. Babylon's decline after him was not immediate but inevitable, because the empire had been shaped around one psyche, one vision, one force of will. And when that will vanished, the system lost coherence. Historians now recognize Nebuchadnezzar as both culmination and warning, the peak of Babylonian power and the beginning of its unraveling. His life marked the moment when Babylon reached its highest expression and exhausted the model that sustained it. And this exhaustion was not visible immediately, but history reveals it clearly in hindsight. His story also reshaped how power itself is understood. Ancient kings often claimed divine favor, but Nebuchadnezzar's experience challenged that claim, suggesting limits even within sacred kingship, suggesting that God's fate, or reality itself, does not tolerate unchecked arrogance indefinitely. Whether interpreted religiously or psychologically, the message remains consistent. Identity inflated beyond human scale collapses inward. And this insight echoes across centuries, influencing later political thought, moral philosophy, and cultural storytelling. Nebuchadnezzar became an archetype, the ruler who reached too far, the builder whose monuments could not protect his mind, the conqueror who learned humility through erasure rather than wisdom. And archetypes endure longer than empires, because they adapt to new contexts, new anxieties, new audiences. Modern historians strip away myth to examine evidence. Yet even stripped of legend, Nebuchadnezzar remains extraordinary, his administrative achievements real, his urban planning revolutionary, his geopolitical impact undeniable, and his psychological collapse historically significant. Not because it was unique, but because it was recorded, remembered, and interpreted. Many rulers likely suffered similar fates, but vanished without trace. Nebuchadnezzar endured in memory precisely because his life intersected with narrative traditions that preserved his transformation. And preservation is power of a different kind. His legacy today exists not in walls or gates, but in questions. Questions about leadership, ambition, identity, and limits. Questions that remain relevant because human psychology has not changed as much as technology. The temptation to equate success with worth, authority with truth, dominance with destiny persists. And Nebuchadnezzar stands as one of history's clearest warnings against that temptation. His judgment by history is therefore neither simple condemnation nor uncritical praise. It is complexity, admiration tempered by caution, recognition shadowed by consequence, and this balanced judgment may be the most honest tribute possible, because it acknowledges the full human spectrum he embodied, the brilliance and the blindness, the creation and the collapse, the power and the cost. Nebuchadnezzar ruled the world, reshaped it, and then lost himself within it. And history remembers him not because he believed he was a god, but because he learned what happens when a man forgets he is not. Nebuchadnezzar's story does not end with Babylon's fall or with the fading of his name into ancient texts. It continues wherever power exists, wherever leaders rise rapidly, wherever success begins to feel permanent, because his life is not just history. It is a pattern, a warning written into time itself. When we look at Nebuchadnezzar from a modern perspective, we are not simply examining an ancient king. We are examining the psychology of dominance, the seduction of success, and the danger of mistaking achievement for identity. Nebuchadnezzar did not begin as a monster or a madman. He began as a capable leader shaped by chaos. Raised in a world where survival demanded strength, where empires crushed or were crushed, and his early victories rewarded decisiveness, confidence, and control. Qualities that modern societies still celebrate: ambition, vision, relentless drive. Yet what his story reveals is how these qualities, when left unbalanced, slowly transform into obsession, entitlement, and isolation. The moment Nebuchadnezzar stopped seeing power as responsibility and began seeing it as proof of superiority, the decline began. And this shift is subtle, because success encouraged confirmation. Applause replaces correction, loyalty replaces honesty, and leaders surrounded by praise lose access to reality. Nebuchadnezzar's madness was not sudden. It was the final stage of a long psychological process, a process modern leaders still experience in different forms. The belief that one is indispensable, that systems exist because of personal brilliance, that dissent is disloyalty, that caution is weakness, that humility is unnecessary. And these beliefs are not ancient, they are timeless. Nebuchadnezzar teaches us that power does not merely corrupt behavior, it reshapes identity. When leaders begin to see themselves as symbols rather than humans, they lose the ability to self-correct. And without self-correction, collapse becomes inevitable. His story also challenges the assumption that collapse always comes from external threats. Babylon did not fall because its walls failed. It fell because belief failed, because relevance faded, because fear evaporated. And this lesson resonates deeply in the modern world where institutions often appear strong until suddenly they are not. Corporations, governments, movements, all can endure materially while eroding psychologically. Once people stop believing in inevitability, they begin imagining alternatives. And alternatives are the beginning of change. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon lost its future the moment it relied on past glory instead of present adaptability. And this pattern repeats endlessly. Success freezes systems, discourages innovation, and breeds complacency. While rivals grow quietly, learn patiently, and wait strategically. Persia did not defeat Babylon with spectacle. It defeated it with relevance. And relevance is the most dangerous enemy of stagnation. Nebuchadnezzar also reminds us that legacy is fragile. Despite unmatched achievements, his name survives primarily as a cautionary figure. Not because he failed to build, but because he failed to sustain balance. Monuments crumbled, empires vanished, but the story endured. And stories endure because they teach. His life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. That brilliance does not guarantee wisdom, that authority does not equal truth, that strength without humility becomes isolation, and that identity built solely on dominance collapses when dominance fades. Modern societies often repeat Nebuchadnezzar's mistake in different language, elevating leaders to mythic status, treating success as moral proof, equating popularity with correctness, and dismissing warnings as negativity. Nebuchadnezzar's fall shows where this path leads, not always to dramatic destruction, but often to quiet irrelevance. The most haunting part of his story is not his madness, but the silence that followed his power. Babylon did not burn in memory, it faded, and fading is more terrifying than destruction because it denies meaning. Nebuchadnezzar also teaches us about the cost of dehumanization. He ruled through fear, relocated populations, destroyed identities. And while this created stability temporarily, it produced resentment that waited patiently for opportunity. Power gained through fear always generates its own opposition, even if delayed, and when fear disappears, resentment remains. Modern systems that rely on intimidation rather than consent face the same delayed consequences. His later humility, born not of wisdom but of collapse, offers another lesson, that transformation is possible but costly. Humility learned early preserves power. Humility learned late salvages dignity. Nebuchadnezzar survived his fall, but survival required the erasure of everything he believed himself to be. And this raises a final question: how much loss is required before awareness arrives? Must collapse always precede reflection? Or can history be learned without repetition? Nebuchadnezzar's story suggests that reflection without consequence is rare. But awareness of history increases the chance of restraint. This is why his life matters, not as ancient drama, but as psychological blueprint. His journey from conqueror to cautionary figure illustrates the arc of unchecked ambition, the illusion of permanence, and the inevitability of limitation. The modern world often believes itself different, more advanced. more rational, yet the core drivers of power remain unchanged. Ambition, fear, validation, control, identity. Nebuchadnezzar's story cuts through centuries to remind us that technology changes faster than psychology. And psychology shapes destiny. The final lesson of Nebuchadnezzar is not that power is evil, but that power without self-awareness is dangerous. That greatness without humility collapses inward, and that empires, institutions, and individuals endure not by dominating reality, but by adapting to it. Babylon fell quietly, but its lesson speaks loudly, echoing across time, warning every generation that rises too fast, believes too deeply, and listens too little. Because history does not punish ambition, it punishes arrogance. And Nebuchadnezzar's life stands as one of humanity's clearest demonstrations of that truth. A king who ruled the world, believed himself divine, lost everything that defined him, and in losing it revealed the most human truth of all. That no matter how high one rises, reality eventually demands humility. And those who refuse to offer it willingly will be forced to learn it through loss, silence, and memory. And that is why Nebuchadnezzar's story still matters. Because it is not about ancient Babylon alone. It is about every age that mistakes power for permanence, success for destiny, and dominance for meaning.